Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to the Autonomy Digital Industry Talks. Today, I have the pleasure of presenting our next conference, presented by Hogan Lovells on the following topic: Urban Logistics, Sustainable Solutions. Today, the conversation is going to be led by Patrick Ayad and Joanne Rotondi of Hogan Lovells. So Patrick and Joanne, take it away.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and welcome everyone to our panel on urban logistics, sustainable solutions. Obviously, urbanization is still a mega trend, and so is urban mobility, but more specifically today, urban logistics. We have two really great industry experts that I want to briefly introduce. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So we have Tom Elvidge with us, who is Senior Vice President at Arrival for product or vehicle programs and design. As a very, some of you will know him with a great history at Goldman Sachs, Uber and WeWork, and now at this new disruptor and transformer of the mobility industry, Arrival. Everyone is looking at your company and what it is doing going forward. So really excited to have you with us. And then Natalie Sauber, who is market intelligence, responsible for market intelligence and future mobility at Arcadis. And Natalie, we've worked on a number of occasions together, particularly on conferences like this, and it's always impressive the insight that you give us from an industry perspective. Before I briefly turn to Joanne, just briefly about myself, Patrick Ayad. I'm the global leader for mobility and transportation. And under this umbrella, mobility and transportation, we have basically three sectors, or industry sectors, as we call them: automotive, aerospace, defense, and then the third one is transport and logistics. And the reason why we've structured this in this way is simply because we truly believe in the convergence of all modes of transport. And I think urban logistics is also something specifically where you can see that. So Joanne, as you are heading the transport and logistics industry sector, why is urban logistics so important also for you?
Thank you, Patrick. As you mentioned, I do head our transport and logistics industry sector. In my own practice, I'm focused on largely regulatory requirements, mainly environmental perspective for automotive and engine OEMs, trucking, for example. In the sector, we are truly multimodal. We have everything from rail, traditional, shipping, trucking, to emerging tech like drones and urban air mobility, micromobility. So we're truly multimodal, global. We also have multi-practice practitioners, regulatory, commercial, corporate, IP, and litigation. Logistics, particularly in an urban setting, is a complex ecosystem of many players, many companies, organizations, and of course, regulatory entities. And so, bringing the whole of all of these different practices to bear in this space is really important. With the rise of e-commerce, particularly same-day delivery, and following what we've all been experiencing during COVID, I think there's no going back from that. So the expectations have been set by consumers, and coordinating together to generate solutions across all of these entities and complex ecosystem is truly important, particularly now. So thank you for this.
Thanks, Joanne. And clearly this is a good start to bring in Natalie on our first topic. We've structured this in a way that we cover basically three areas. And the first one, and you just said it, of course, Corona and all these lockdowns have brought us a new trend, probably. Natalie, if you could explore on that, which is called multi-story. So could you please let us know what is it and what differentiates multi-story from more traditional warehouse solutions?
Yeah, sure thing. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I guess multi-story is really sort of like often used as a catch-all phrase for all sort of like various types of facilities, while some of them are sort of like have some mezzanine levels, which are accessed internally using lifts. Others will have vehicle access and dock doors in each sort of like of the floor. I guess the appropriateness of each of the solution will really depend on the building function, level of automation, single, multi-tenant, nature of the facility. So that's sort of like all of the technical, just getting it out there. But what Joanne already briefly mentioned, yes, last year was pretty intense. We've seen a massive increase in all things e-commerce on the one hand. So we do have a lot more delivery trucks running around our cities. We've got people obviously wanting to shop more online. We live in the sort of like anytime, anywhere, anything mentality or world where we do kind of expect our necessary toothbrush Amazon $2.99 delivery to be delivered within the next sort of like hour. But obviously that puts a lot of pressure on the infrastructure, on cities, both sort of like in the city and urban. And of course, also we are experiencing a heavily land scarcity, not just here in London /UK, but also across many other European cities where land is a pretty hot commodity. And sort of like to satisfy all of that increased appetite for 24-hour delivery slots, we kind of need to think about it in different ways. And some of the more traditional warehouses might not be able to cater for that increased appetite of all of these parcels. And one way, just looking to Asia, because they seem to be always doing or always one step ahead of us, have actually been sort of like, if the land isn't there particularly, or if you're only sort of like left with a bit of restricted land, then why not build up? And that's where the sort of like future sci-fi multi-story warehouse thing comes in, where you've seen some of the sort of like render designs on the internet, where you've got these sort of like 4, 6, 7-story high sort of like buildings, and they sort of like been catered to different needs. You've got drones flying in on the top, and then you have sort of like different access vehicles at the bottom, and just trying to sort of like make use of some of that demand that we're currently looking to quench at this point in time.
Yeah, that's great. And I really like the phrase, I think anything, anywhere, anytime, right? This is like it's really the consumer demand to the customer, looking at the customer, which is always important. And of course, you said China is leading. I mean, of course, they are also ahead of COVID, as we all know. It started there now, so they have some advantage here in further developing these solutions. So it will clearly disrupt the traditional warehouse industry. One question I would have, would the traditional warehousing companies then still try to deal with this issue? I mean, try to transform also in that way, or are there rather new players coming in who will take over on this topic, or is it maybe both?
I think it potentially will be a mixture of both. I mean, let's be really frank here, especially in the UK, we do have so-called life signs of multi-story. Obviously, they're effectively sort of like on a mezzanine level. I think the UK market, and I guess European market as well, have been kind of opposing the whole idea of multi-story, just always pushing back, saying we don't need it. It's not viable. It's going to be way more costly to sort of like build these types of warehouses, never mind whether it's conversion, brownfield, greenfield site, or what have you not. But I think what needs to happen, especially from the industry, from the logistics perspective, is that we need to sort of like be faced with the reality in terms of, look, this is what's currently happening. There is going to be an increase in demand. Cities will, regardless of COVID and sort of like an exodus of cities, will increase, or will have this increase of more people being there. And that is just one way of potentially addressing that solution. I think it will be, back to your question, Patrick, it will be a mixture of both. I think obviously we're going to have our traditional developers who've obviously been doing really good across the board. And they have been, again, looking into that, but it's probably more of a cost factor at the moment, which is surprising because, of course, one of the challenges that puts people off from the development point of view is sort of like that, the cost in terms of the construction cost of it. So yes, of course, there's a point around upgraded foundations. You know, you've got the fright to think about. It's obviously a lot more complex than structural frame and building these sort of like additional levels. Then, of course, you have to provide the ramps. You have to provide access to SUVs, access to upper levels. And then also in terms of whether you want to just have that as one multi-story logistic hubs, or whether you want to get other tenants invited in as well. I mean, there shouldn't be a reason why we can't multi-purpose this entire building. So say, for example, have data centers in the basement, have logistics on sort of like the ground 1 and 2 levels, and then have something else on the upper levels as well. There is no reason for us to not sort of like think about that. But I guess it's the cost on the one hand, the sort of like the architectural design challenges on the other hand, that is just putting a lot of people off and saying, look, we might just be better doing as we've always been doing. But I think that's potentially not going to work really well 5-10 years down the line. So I much rather just approach that from the status as if, and saying, look, if we do something now, we might actually be able to come at it also from a more sustainable angle, which I think is also just something I want to mention.
Yeah, and of course, you know, multi-story matches well with multimodal. And as you already mentioned, I mean, the drones coming from the top, and then you have like the train system or trucks on the ground. So I think a lot can be expected here. Maybe a final question before we move further then with Joanne and Tom. Specifically at Arcadis, how do you leading on this topic? Tell us a bit, maybe briefly, what you can do there.
So what we've done at Arcadis, and for everyone who doesn't know, we are a global design engineering consultancy. We've actually created a modeling tool. And what it allows our clients to do is to almost sort of like dynamically consider a wide range of variables, which will impact or which will have an impact on the commercial viability of a multi-story facility. So really sort of like going at it from the early decision process in terms of what type of land is currently available, how expensive is it to build either a multi-story or a single multi-story facilities, and sort of like almost guide them around the early decision, the investment decisions of where the cost, sort of like cost break ratio would be. And then really sort of like developing a very soundproof plan with clients to say, it could be multi-story or it could just be a single story, but taking that fear factor away from the cost, because I think that's what a lot of our clients are always a bit funny about when it comes to that. So just having some hard-based evidence and numbers is obviously is a quite nice way of approaching it, and just having a look at different solutions out there.
Very good. Thank you very much, Natalie. And now, Joanne, you will guide us through the next topic, please.
Sure. Thanks, Patrick. Another possible solution to the scarcity of land that Natalie was just describing, of course, is repurposing, reusing existing retail, for example, existing commercial spaces, has a lot of benefits there. And, you know, Tom, we're delighted to have you speak to these topics. In particular, I know Arrival is doing so much with the microfactories. So maybe you could touch on this topic, tell us a little bit more about the microfactory approach, and if there's an opportunity to reuse existing spaces.
Sure, thanks, Joanne. Hi, everyone. I guess, first of all, it's maybe worth giving a brief intro for anyone who's not familiar with Arrival. But we're a technology company that is developing electric vehicles really from the ground up. So starting with the design of not only the vehicle itself, but also the majority of the components that go into the vehicle. So all of the electric components, the battery modules are designed. In fact, about 2/3 of the vehicle by value is designed and built in-house by Arrival. So we're sort of quite vertically integrated in that regard. And one of the things, as you say, that we are focused on is producing our vehicles not in sort of traditional automotive factories that are, you know, generally speaking, very, very large. There could be many hundreds of thousands of square meters, but in what we call micro factories that are, by comparison, far smaller. We target something around 10,000 square meters for an Arrival micro factory. And these micro factories are able to produce any one of the 3 products that we're currently developing, that is a bus, a van, and an Arrival car. And the way that we can do that is really the only way that you can be able to produce in a facility of that size and comparatively so much smaller, is to begin the process of design with that intent very much in mind. So really looking at what is the cutting edge of robotic assembly techniques, all of the upper body and what is traditionally a sort of metal stamping in most vehicles is replaced by Arrival's composite technology. This is a polypropylene glass fiber that is sort of fully proprietary to Arrival, and it allows for a complete reimagining of the way that that process takes place. It's also a material that is stronger and lighter and much more durable than sort of metal counterparts. All of that said, what it allows us to do, as you say, and coming onto the topic, is to look at how we could, locate these factories very close to the centers of demand. So, we envisage a world where we have micro factories located in really many cities all over the world that are very close to the end customers, whether it's, buses here in London, for example, or anywhere else for that matter, rapidly reducing, of course, the overall logistics cost and time and impact of having to ship vehicles all over the world. So, the type of facilities that can be used ultimately can be ones that are far smaller. And if we think about the availability of a 10,000 square meter facility in comparison to one that is, many times larger than that, there are, of course, huge numbers of those. So as we've been starting to prepare, we've announced several micro factories already that we're going to start production in, both here in the UK and in the US. And as we're looking at future sites for some of the vehicles that are coming along, there are numerous options for those, as you say.
It's fascinating. Thank you. Really interesting stuff. I want to geek out with you on vehicle design topics. And so maybe just a little bit more on this topic. From the manufacturing and design perspective, are there other ways that you can contribute to this sort of ecosystem approach of, localization and improving the sustainability of the logistic last mile?
Absolutely. One of the things that Arrival is really focused on is how do we help cities to realize their net zero targets. And it's for that reason, amongst a number of others, that Arrival started out with the products that we did. So a bus and a commercial van can be huge contributors to helping cities to get to that goal of net zero, for the simple reason that these are the vehicles that are performing many miles on roads within cities around the world. And starting there has many benefits, but just overall contributes to that ecosystem. Just a couple of weeks ago, additionally, we announced the sort of third program that we're working on at the moment, which is the Arrival car. And that is targeted not as a consumer product per se, but actually as one that is custom designed for drivers of ride hailing services. So think of it as the ideal vehicle for an Uber driver, or indeed Lyft or Ola for that matter. But again, the reason that we have looked to that as a use case is because, astonishingly, there are now, comfortably over 30 million drivers of these services around the world, predominantly within cities, of course, and contributing 4, 5, 6 times as many miles in those vehicles as somebody who's, private car owner. So therefore, the impact that we can have collectively by electrifying those vehicles in the same way as a delivery van can be outsized in comparison to private car owners upgrading their vehicle to an EV.
Yeah, particularly during COVID, I'll confess, especially with my teenagers, those ride-hailing services are also delivering us goods and meals and things like that, at least in the US. So that's great stuff. Patrick and Natalie, I want to let you guys also address the topic of repurposing before we move to more on net zero. So
yeah, sure. I mean, Tom, when you said that, we want to be there where the logistics happens with our facilities, I mean, that's really contrary to what the automotive industry, for example, has done in the last 20 years or so, because they thought production has to be in cheaper countries or so. But still, you believe that this is the way forward. I mean, it's also, of course, cost effective and the like, sustainable in any case. So this is, do you think that also this will change the more traditional industries then, and the way they have manufactured in the last, I don't know how many years?
Well, I think it's perhaps not contradictory to the aspirations that traditional automotive manufacturers would have had. I think locating close to the center of demand and where you want to sell your product is, you know, the objective of any organization, of course, because you reduce your costs. But the process with which vehicles have been made, you know, for much of the last 100 years or so, has meant that it has led to a very high volume and very standardized set of products, because the processes involved with, let's say, metal stamping, as just to take one example, that has enormous tooling costs, many hundreds of millions of dollars that would go into producing the tools that are required to develop that part of the vehicle. So it has required a pretty fundamental rethink of the way that the vehicles are designed and made, and the materials that are used to enable a far lower tooling cost to be brought about. And that's one of the things that Arrival is developing, is with the introduction of composite materials and the move away from steel as the sort of primary material for much of the body structure. That means that the tooling costs can be lower, therefore locating in many more factories and having a much more distributed approach is possible, versus a highly concentrated and highly standardized process. That also incidentally enables a much greater number of different vehicles as well, because historically automotive manufacturers have been, you know, it's been an economic incentive to retain the design for as long as possible, because that reduces that very high tooling cost of investment again. So through lower tooling and different materials, it can actually open up the possibility to, you know, more different vehicle designs over time.
Thank you, Tom. And Natalie, maybe also from your perspective, being close to the market, close to the customer, even in the city, what is your perspective on that?
I guess first things first, I was actually fortunate enough to visit Arrival and the manufacturing facility. Well, I guess they're called micro facility. And honestly, there's just one word to describe it. It's kind of cool. It's super clean, very cool. And the Arrival people do scoot around skateboards a lot in terms of the different production sites. So that's been it's pretty dope. So if you get into Tom's good side, definitely recommend you doing that. I guess more on the topic around repurposing on existing buildings. Of course, they can potentially be significantly more sustainable than knocking it down and rebuilding it. Obviously, the chance to use any old building could help many companies to reach their goal to net zero carbon. But I probably focus more around speed to market, sustainability, technical expertise. So obviously, it's quicker to convert an existing facility than to build a new one. We all know that. There's also a lot less embodied carbon in retrofit, again, from a sustainability angle, which I think is quite important. And then, of course, also it's a more sustainable option. However, there obviously are some technical problems or challenges around that. So understanding the constraints of existing buildings, you know, like floor loadings, layout constraints, all of these things that can be potentially as deemed a little bit more risky around that. So you kind of just really need a safe pair of hands to guide you through some of the technical issues, but that shouldn't stop you. And I think especially from a city angle again, and obviously we all see in the news, we know that certain high streets or certain sort of like big box retailers are struggling, are closing down, and it leaves a lot of sort of like retail space open up for grabs. For whatever it might be, whether that's a last mile logistic hubs, whether that's course, city center micro factory, or whether that's something else entirely. It really depends. But I think if we can be open enough and have a playful attitude around that, there's quite a bit of opportunity for that. And as I've mentioned previously, look guys, land is scarce. So we kind of are being dealt with the cards, and I think it's time to look upwards and see how we can sort of like innovate on that level.
Very good. Joanne, do you want to take us also through the third topic that we wanted to address today?
Sure, I think we've probably all mentioned it already, carbon, net zero. So let's switch gears and move to that. As everyone probably knows, both the US and the EU have set targets for net zero carbon neutrality by 2050. In the US, our current president has also announced new targets for reducing GHG emissions by about 50% by 2030. So many companies at the same time are also making decarbonization pledges as part of their ESG. Let's discuss the case for electrifying the fleets. Tom, I'm going to go to you first, I think. How does vehicle electrification, electrifying the fleets, fit into the evolving landscape, you know, from the OEM perspective?
Well, I think what's interesting when we talk about fleets, first of all, and you know, again, one of the things that Arrival is sort of very focused on is there can be comparatively a higher degree of rationality in the purchasing decision when it comes to, you know, let's take the fleet of an organization with a fleet of delivery vehicles, for example. The decision on whether or not to go electric is actually quite different from a consumer decision on whether or not you want to buy an electric vehicle for a number of reasons. First of all, the miles driven by a goods vehicle within a city are quite, you know, they're quite easy to calculate on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, and therefore the technology that's required in terms of number of batteries and the range of the vehicle can be far more accurately defined. Secondly, these vehicles that do many miles, as we talked about a few minutes ago, and therefore the total cost of ownership over the life of the vehicle can be much lower than a petrol or diesel equivalent. And that means that the decision is actually not one that is necessarily about sustainability or net zero, although increasingly, of course, that's such an important topic for all companies. But if the decision can just simply be that it's cheaper to own electric delivery vehicles, then, you know, the job is almost done. You know, it's kind of won at that point. And that really sort of squarely describes what Arrival is focused on. We believe that there shouldn't be a premium paid on the decision to go electric. And in that regard, I think the decision is very different for fleets as it is for, let's say, a consumer choosing whether or not to buy a personal electric vehicle, where the purchasing decision is often sort of predicated by the very occasional, very long journey that somebody might do of, you know, 300 miles once or twice a year, for example. And that sort of, that doesn't feature quite the same way as it does with, you know, when talking about fleets.
And maybe, Natalie, you also want to add to this topic when we specifically talk about net zero carbon cities, and particularly on the logistics side. I assume there are various things that we need to do here. Do you want to elaborate a little bit further on this and your thoughts on how we can drive this forward, this topic?
Yeah, sure thing. So I guess on the one hand, totally agree with what Tom says. Some really, really valuable points. I guess from a city perspective and also logistics, we obviously have our low emission zones here, especially in London, but also in other cities around Europe per se. So that's, I think, really, really helping. I think what's really important here is that fleet operators do need to take a massive stance on that. And we've already seen some of the big names out there looking to decarbonize their fleet. And we've helped them from an Arcadis perspective. We've helped some of them as well, especially also within the retail side of things, but also from a charging infrastructure, because you can't talk about EVs and not talk about charging infrastructure. But I won't actually take any sides on that. But it's really important, because it's all good and great to basically be putting these vehicles, whatever they may, you know, whether they're pure EV, whether they're BAF hydrogen, or what have you not, but you obviously also need to make sure that the infrastructure is there as well, so that's been basically set up and running, and then also the people are educated enough in terms of why a switch to battery electric is essential, and what that potentially entails and means. And I think companies, corporations have a big role to play in that, from a role model perspective, in terms of, yeah, we're taking that seriously. Net zero carbon 2050, great, but we're actually going to accelerate our shift, you know, whether that be 2030 or 2045, and really sort of like taking a stance along that. And some of the newer entrants, and that's, I think, is quite nice, and especially with Arrival as well, who don't have that legacy, you know, who don't carry that baggage or legacy with them. It's amazing what you can do with a blank sheet of paper, and you're not combined, and you're not constrained sort of like with previous clients or with previous technology, and you can really start fresh and new. And I think that's where we see quite a bit of a shakeup in the industry, both from a logistics perspective, you know, whether that's drones, don't really want to go into that, whether it's last mile robots, but also whether that's in terms of general vehicle platform strategy, and sort of like trying to figure out, how do we make room for the battery? How do we make room for the hydrogen fuel tanks? And really sort of like pushing that massive conglomerate automotive sort of like in the direction. It's going to take quite a few years, but that's why we've got companies like Arrival and Tesla and some of the other ones as well, to sort of like probably push and also lead in certain instances to get us to that net zero target sooner rather than later.
Thanks, Natalie. And maybe Tom, let me ask you one question about, because you were talking about the platform, and basically also I want to speak just briefly about also battery technology sourcing, Tom. I don't know, I mean, sustainability is really important, but it's also when you do the sourcing of the battery technology, and it is of course environmental, there are environmental aspects, there are ethical aspects. How is Arrival dealing with these issues?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we're very fortunate to have a very strong supplier partnership for the batteries that we use, and you know, I think when it comes to the question of the sort of the technology and the components that are going into the batteries, there is a sort of very important discussion around exactly how we can continue to meet the goals that we have, and how can we ensure that the components are sustainable from that perspective. But you know, equally, the really important thing that I think is going on in regard to net zero, particularly within cities at the moment, is more around air quality. And I think it is on that topic that it's you know, that we have such an obligation to try and transition as quickly as possible. And you know, to your point earlier, I think there is no one single party that's going to be able to migrate towards that. It's going to be a very much a collective industry approach with government as well, to be able to move the industry with the infrastructure, the vehicles, and you know, the right products at the right price, to be able to actually get to a point where we can, you know, move away from petrol and diesel vehicles.
Thanks, Tom. And maybe Joanne, we still have a bit time, maybe also to speak briefly about the regulatory landscape, and maybe then also involve at the end our experts again on what their wish is when it comes to regulatory efforts. That would also interest me. But Joanne, give us maybe a brief perspective from the US, and I can then maybe add from the EU side before we finally involve our experts again.
Sure. In the US, as you all know, we have a new presidential administration, and our president has had about roughly 4 months in office. He's made a number of commitments, including the reducing by 50%, you know, GHG emissions of 2005 levels by 2030. Also net zero commitments. But officially, we have no real rules yet. we don't know what the actual requirements will be coming out of the federal US EPA, DOT, Biden administration. So what's happening in the interim, a lot is happening in the industry, of course, but a couple of things. One, the state of California is pushing the envelope, particularly with regard to zero emission vehicles and their proposals for vehicles, trucks, both existing emissions, combustion emissions, reductions, as well as mandates for electric or fuel cell hydrogen vehicles, zero emission vehicles, to 100% by 2035 is the goal. And then two, in the interim, companies are trying to get out ahead of it and making their own commitments publicly to net zero, carbon neutrality, or full electrification, zero emission vehicles by a certain date, 2030, 2035, for example. And so what that means is, as the current administration in the US is reviewing and preparing the upcoming rulemakings to govern at least vehicle emissions, which are expected later this year, these commitments and these California requirements are going to be baked in. And so they're de facto nationwide for the US. And so, we're expecting that, and we're, essentially, as our President Biden said at a Ford plant when driving an electric truck earlier this week, electrification is the future and there's no going back. So those are our expectations. I think it's also important to recognize it's just one aspect, the emission regulations. There's also going to be, we expect a greater emphasis on life cycle emissions, battery recycling, for example, battery requirements, end of life requirements, as well as an emphasis on equity and environmental justice topics, which makes more challenges and potentially opportunities for the siting of these facilities. So.
Yeah, I think it's basically, thanks, Joanne, it's basically the same topics, of course, in the EU. It's not just emissions, it's battery technology, which will be highly regulated going forward. And then, of course, end of life, remanufacturing, recycling. These are all like really important points. And this is basically now there are regulations out there on these topics, but you are sometimes missing like the master plan. Although I think the EU is really trying to look into this. And so there is the 2019 European Green Deal, then the 2020 Circular Economy Action Plan. And there is also on the EU level a platform on sustainable urban mobility, the so-called SUMP. And more specifically, and that's also the point, there is a lot of emphasis on urban mobility, but not specifically on urban logistics, which is still being neglected, I think. But here on the EU level, there is also specifically a guide on sustainable urban logistics planning. If you Google it, you will find it. And so there are also some use cases about urban freight transportation or example cases that on the EU level are looked into. Now, given that we have another 3 minutes left, I would like to ask Natalie and Tom, do you have a big wish to the regulators? What would be, like, very briefly in 1 or 2 sentences, what is your biggest wish to the regulators if you had one? Who wants to start? Natalie?
I'm gonna give it a go. Really, really good question. I think I always see the environment or the playing field at the moment a bit like the wild, wild west. So you can have people just coming in because there is no regulation, rightfully, as Joanne says, right? Certain aspects, there is not really a regulation, or if there is, it's been quite outdated. It doesn't fit with the technology that's been coming in. And I'll give you an example. For example, last mile autonomous robots driving on the pavement. There isn't a regulation around that in terms of how do we deal with that. It's the same with drones as well. I mean, they're starting to put something together in terms of figuring out the over airspace. But I think the same goes with last mile cargo bikes as well, the electricity use of that as well. So I think working closer together with the private sector, with the corporations, and trying to sort of like either via competition or via trials, I think is definitely needed. And we've seen pockets of that already happening. I think the barrier has broken down quite significantly between regulators, between the government, and between the companies themselves as well, because we figured out they can't do it all by themselves. There needs to be sort of like a fair play across the entire ecosystem, working on this together. But yes, certain bigger events might step in, you know, whether that's a pandemic, whether that's a change of presidency, that sort of like almost sort of like override certain aspects. But the drumbeat needs to obviously be continuously jumped and pushed ahead. And innovation at the same time also needs to sort of like continuously to drive forward up. So.
Thanks, Natalie. And then I think a few seconds left for Tom now. Your Christmas wish to the regulators.
It's a great question. I mean, I think just thinking about it, I guess the observation I would have is it feels like there's now increasing clarity from regulators and governments that electric is the future, and we need to put our sort of support and investment behind that. I think, you know, if I look at where the challenges are today, there's still, of course, a huge infrastructure question that regulators can play a huge part in, and it becomes very local as a question. You know, where exactly do we want to invest to connect to the grid, have the right space, and sort of help to solve that problem? So I'd probably go with that with my one wish.
Thank you very much. I think we are out of time, so thank you very much, everyone. Joanne, some final words from your side?
Just thank you, and thank you to our speakers and also to Autonomy Digital for the
Thank
opportunity.
you. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Patrick, Natalie, Tom. Thanks a lot. And thank you everyone for tuning in, and stay tuned for the next.
Thank you.